This video is going to introduce the basis of our speech course as far as the theories that are really important. Now, before we can answer the question of what is speech communication, I want to take a moment to really talk about how I approach this course as an educator. And in order to do that, I want to introduce a quote, and this is a quote that I actually got from a professor at University of Washington, Matt McCready. Now, the quote comes from this very happy-looking individual. This is Daniel Webster. He's a famous senator. And his quote is this: "If all my talents and powers were to be taken from me by some unscrutable providence, and I had my choice of keeping but one, I would unhesitatingly ask to be allowed to keep the power of speaking, for through it I would quickly recover all the rest." And I think this quote is so telling, because speaking and speech communication are powerful, right? I am teaching you how to come up with an effective speech and motivate an audience, and those things are important, but I really see this as much more than that. I am helping you to find your voice, to really empower you, because every culture has speech communication at its core. It's how we connect as a people, it's how we change things as groups, and so this is really what we're looking at. So when we talk about the power of speaking, what we're largely talking about is rhetoric. Now, some of you may be familiar with this term. Others of you may be asking, what the heck is rhetoric? Well, in order to answer that question, I am going to need to go back in history. And I'm talking way back, as far as ancient Greece. Now, in ancient Greek times, they had a direct democracy, which is slightly different than what we have, which is a representative democracy. The way in which a direct democracy works is an individual would stand up, and I should clarify here, by individual I mean a white male who was over the age of 25 and owned property. So there was a lot of people who were kept out of this democracy, but of course I digress. So the individual would stand up and say, we need to change this, we need to make this law, or we need to do this. And then maybe someone else might stand up and say, nope, I don't agree with that. So then he would make his case, he would make his case, and then ultimately, based on these speeches, everyone involved in the democracy would vote and change would be enacted, or not if they didn't want it. So Aristotle, who is the individual pictured here, would look at this and say, this is really powerful. We really need to consider this, because this is essentially governing our lives. So when we talk about rhetoric, we typically credit these two individuals, Aristotle and Plato, with being the individuals who created a lot of the theories that we actually still use today. So I'm going to first start off with a definition from Plato about rhetoric. He defines rhetoric as the art of winning the soul by discourse. And I love this definition because first he talks about rhetoric as an art. He actually connects it with poetry in his early writings of rhetoric. And it is very much an art. It's something we're going to be crafting throughout the entire semester. And winning the soul. Right? When we move people to believe things, we are definitely persuading them, but Plato saw this as something much more that could even be something that reacts on a visceral level. And he also was very skeptical about rhetoric because he saw it as being something that's powerful, and of course with great power, right? To quote Spider-Man, comes great responsibility, and that it could be used for something that's not good. Right? Something horrible. And of course, we can look to history to see examples of this. Hitler is probably one of the most famous examples where we have someone using rhetoric to commit great atrocities. And in no way, shape, or form am I trying to celebrate Hitler as a speaker, but we do have to consider the power of rhetoric. Now, Aristotle saw rhetoric as something much more practical, and you can see that in his definition. He defines rhetoric as the faculty of discovering in any particular case all of the available means of persuasion. So, of course, by faculty, he's talking about ability. And two, in any particular case, right? By that, he really means, kind of looking at what's the context, what's going on, what is the speaking situation, and then based on that, how do you find the best way, based on that situation, to persuade? Now, of course, he's saying persuasion here, but a lot of what we do is persuasive in many ways, even if we don't traditionally think of it as persuasion. When you're doing your informative speech, for instance, that's persuasive, right? Because in some ways you have to convince the audience just to believe the information that you're telling them. Now, for a more modern definition, we can look to Gerard Hauser. He defines rhetoric as communication that attempts to coordinate social action. Its goal is to influence human choices on specific matters that require immediate attention. Now, when we look at this is a much broader definition of rhetoric. So we can think of it as something, as simple as a eulogy, right, which coordinates the mourning of individuals. Or a debate, which really works in the political sphere. It can also be something a little less traditional, like an advertisement, which is trying to push you to buy something or believe something. Or a documentary like Blackfish, which has had a real impact on SeaWorld. So all of these things have an impact on your day-to-day life. Now, when we're talking about rhetoric, it is definitely going to be the backbone of the course. And there's two theories that are especially going to be important to the backbone of what we're learning in speech communication. And those two theories are the rhetorical situation and the rhetorical canon. So let's start with the rhetorical situation. This really deals with the context and purpose of what you're going to be talking about. And this goes back to what Aristotle was saying in any particular case, right? So exigence. This is a really important definition to remember because it's the reason for the rhetorical act, right? Or the case. What's going on? So for instance, in a classroom, you're not just going to randomly stand up and start talking, right? People would look at you like you're strange. You have to have an exigence. Speaking without an exigence just seems odd. So if we're defining rhetoric as effectively using language, that's a very broad definition. We can then define the rhetorical situation as the circumstances in which you communicate, right? And the exigence is part of that. The circumstances are also the reason, what's going on, what's the audience, who are you as a speaker. So that's what we're talking about. And I'm getting this definition from Purdue University, just to give credit where credit is due. So for the rhetorical situation, we can also think of this as the rhetorical triangle. And the triangle breaks down into 4 parts. And this is the kind of triangle we're using for speech. Sometimes in English or in other contexts, you may see a slightly different rhetorical triangle. But for our purposes, it's going to have 4 different concepts. And those are the speaker. Who is the speaker, but also how does the speaker want to be seen? And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. The audience. Who are you talking to? The message, what are you trying to say? And purpose, what are you trying to achieve? Now, to some degree, you actually consider the rhetorical situation on a day-to-day basis, but you do it unconsciously. So let's compare 2 situations to kind of see how that works. Let's say you want an A on a paper that you're turning in. You are not going to speak or write the same way as you would on Facebook or any other social network. Why? Well, because you as a speaker is much differently, right? When you're writing a paper, you're trying to be a student. When you're on Facebook, you're presenting your more personal self. Your audience is obviously different. For the paper, it's me, the teacher. And in Facebook, it's your friends and family and peers. Your purpose is also different, right? For the paper, like we said, you want to get the A. For Facebook, you could have a variety of purposes. Maybe you're trying to brag about something you did or share information on something you're proud of or elicit sympathy for friends when you're upset. And of course, the message is going to be specifically what you say. Now, you probably don't think about each of these things, speaker, message, purpose, audience, when you're engaging in these activities, but a good speaker will both understand how to utilize them and to look at other speakers to really determine what the rhetorical situation is. Now, to give you a little bit more information about the rhetorical situation, I'm going to show a short clip from a video that another professor created that I think really effectively gives an example of how this can work in your day-to-day life.
In the video and Introduction to Rhetoric, we described rhetoric as the study of how meaningful communication occurs and how we might best shape our writing or speech to meet the demands of particular situations. In this video, we'll analyze an example rhetorical situation with the rhetorical triangle in order to better understand what we mean when we talk about rhetoric. Let's say you're facing a situation that many incoming students do. You have to buy textbooks and they cost a lot. In fact, you're about $300 short of what you thought you needed. Now you need to ask for a little help. You begin to think of some people you might be able to ask and what you might say to each: a friend, your parents, and perhaps your boss. In order to think about this rhetorically, we'll need to analyze the situation at hand. That is, we need to break it down by the components we saw in our first video on the rhetorical triangle: the speaker, audience, text or message, and purpose. As we do that, our overarching goal is to think about how we might need to change our message based on how these components change and interact. Let's first look at what you might say to your friend. The relationship is probably quite close and casual, so we might simply walk up to the friend and ask, "Hey, any way you could help me with money for books? You know I'm good for it." With your parents, whom you also have a close relationship with, you could probably also be quite casual and simply ask them, "Hey Mom and Dad, is there any way I could borrow $300? It's for books for school. I promise I won't spend it on anything else and I'll pay you back really soon." Now, things may very well change with your boss, depending on how close you are to them. Chances are you have a more formal relationship with them than with your friends or family, and it's worth keeping in mind that your boss has a position of power over you. So here, your communication might be more formal. You might even think about sending a letter or email to your boss since, in a business setting, those can be more professional than simply approaching them and speaking in person. So perhaps we write, "Dear Mrs. Smith, I'm writing to ask if you might be able to advance me $300 in pay so that I can buy textbooks for school. It's not quite prepared for how expensive they all were going to be, and would very much appreciate your helping me out. Thank you for your consideration. Sincerely, Travis." As you can see, in each case our message changes somewhat to better fit the new situation. In this case, those changes might seem pretty obvious, to the point that thinking about this rhetorically wasn't maybe necessary. But more is happening that first meets the eye here, so let's take a look at the rhetorical dynamics of what's happening. When thinking about this rhetorically, we do know that in each situation our purpose was the same, to persuade our audience to loan us money for books. So to make things a little clearer, let's pull that out. What did change each time was our audience. First our friend, then our family, and lastly our boss. As we saw, when our audience changed, so did the message. Another way of saying that is that the audience influenced how we composed our message, or what our message looked and sounded like. With our friend, it was okay to just go up and talk to them, so we used speech, and we were informal because we know our friend well. The one thing that we did add was the promise of repayment. Because we're borrowing a decent amount of money, the friend probably wants to know they'll get it back. With our parents, we would probably still go up and talk to them because we know them so well, so speech again. But we might also be a little more formal than we were with our friend. And here we added an extra promise of responsibility because we know that our parents would want to think we're responsible people. Where it changes most, of course, is with our boss. We're not used to asking someone who's in a position of power over us for favors, so the way we approach it needs to be a little more delicate. In fact, it's probably a good idea to change the form of the message entirely, from simply going up to the boss and asking something so unusual, to writing a letter, which is more formal and businesslike, something your boss might appreciate. Here too, some more explanation might be called for because the request is an unusual one to make to your boss. And of course, because it's not someone you're close to, some extra thanks wouldn't hurt. So the audience then determines how or what we speak or write. And at its most basic, that's rhetoric. Changing how we communicate in the situation at hand in order to have the best result, whether that result is to persuade someone, inform them, or accomplish some other purpose. It's important to keep in mind something we mentioned in our introduction to the concept of rhetoric, and that's that every part of the rhetorical situation affects each other part. For example, though it might not seem like it, you as the speaker or writer change throughout this. If you think about it from your audience's point of view, you probably appeared like a different person in each case. That is, to your friend, you were an easygoing, nice, informal buddy. To your parents, you were the good, responsible son or daughter. And for your boss, your letter signaled to her that you were a respectful, hardworking, grateful employee that they'd be most likely to help out. In that sense, the audience helps determine how the writer or speaker will want to appear, and so we can see how another part of the rhetorical triangle is affected by the audience. And we can keep drawing our arrows here. Another way to think about this is that the persona we wanted to express changed the message we gave as well. So, when we wanted to appear like the good child, we told our parents how responsible we would be when we spoke to them. And we can think about it the other way as well. The message we've crafted tells the audience who we are as a person, so in that sense, the text or message defines the speaker or writer. And of course, the speaker or writer, if they do their job well, is going to have an effect on the audience, making them do, think, or believe something. So the speaker or writer affects the audience too. Similarly, because the speaker or writer is only known through their message or text, the text or message has an effect on the audience. And so all of these connect. They all affect each other, and they all work together in order to meet our purpose. Now, if this seems really complex, one thing to note here is that you don't necessarily need to consider all of these angles at once. The example here is to show you how the rhetorical situation could be considered. But as you're going to see in your class, part of using rhetoric well is finding out which of these angles to focus on the most.
So now that we've covered the rhetorical situation, let's cover the second part, which is the rhetorical canon. So, the canons of rhetoric are basically 5 things. They break down into invention, arrangement, style, memory, and delivery. So I'm going to talk about each one. So invention is basically the first step in the speech-making process. It's finding persuasive ways to get information, getting your topic, your research, developing your speech. That's really what invention involves. The second part is once you have the material, right, you have all the things that you're going to do, how do you organize it? So this is where we'll be talking about organizational formats, transitions, introduction, conclusion, etc. Then, once you've done that, you basically decorate the speech, which is why I kind of have a Christmas picture here, right? So using language that's going to add to what you're trying to say, using things like metaphors and rhetorical questions and other sort of literary devices. Then, you want to memorize the speech. Now, this, of course, was a Greek thing. You guys are not going to have to memorize the speech, so don't worry in case you're panicking at this point. But I would encourage that you practice, because if you look at any of the professional speakers, for instance, TED Talkers, they never have note cards. Now, you can use note cards during your speech, but the ultimate goal of a speaker is to really have the speech in your mind, not memorize word for word, but that you know it well enough that you can ad-lib it effectively, and by ad-lib I mean off the top of your head. And then, of course, the last step, deliver the speech. So we'll be talking about things like eye contact, tone variation, hand gestures, things like that. So when we talk about the rhetorical canon, I really like to talk about it as basically steps, right? That you go and take each step individually, and then it ultimately leads to the speech. You start with invention, then you arrange your material by organizing it, you add style and flair, you practice it, and then you deliver the actual speech itself. So keep in mind that the rhetorical canon is going to come up for each speech, right? So for every speech that we do, we'll have a rhetorical situation, then we'll start the invention process, the arrangement process, adding style, practicing, and delivery. And same thing for all the other speeches that we do. Each one's going to have a different rhetorical situation, a different invention process, arrangement, style, memory, and delivery. So that is how that's going to actually be working in the course. So that is it. Let's talk homework now. Answer these 5 questions, and remember you also have to do the video on topic, so make sure you're doing that as well. These two work together, but basically these are the questions. Answer them, and that is it.